Redshift, Book 1 in the Singularity. R.M. Olson. Copyright 2021, R.M. Olson. All rights reserved. Chapter 16, Savina. Savina's temper had not improved by the time they reached the Rochosa port and docked, but she managed a thin smile at the captain as she stepped past her and onto the loading ramp. "I programmed your restraint to allow you access to the ship's main deck and your cabin," she said. "You could try to get off and warn someone, but—" She gave a small shrug. "Of course," said Joska in a dry voice. "You have the restraint pulses set to level 10. Don't worry, I remember." Savina gave her a frigid nod, then stalked down the loading dock and into the port. She made her way to the dockport duty master's office. She'd radioed in ahead of time and sent a deposit of credits, and with that assurance she'd been allowed to land, although her docking bay had not been authorized for access yet, which meant no repairs, no unloading, and no additional fuel cells until she'd paid the full price. She had it, but barely. This would wipe out everything she'd earned from her last job, plus most of her savings. But she gave a small shiver. But if she didn't get back in time, that may not actually matter. There may not be any family to send money back to. The port duty master seemed charmed to make her acquaintance, and after a friendly chat, where Savina explained with wide, innocent eyes that the captain she'd acquired the ship from hadn't bothered to explain that the port fees hadn't been paid until the transfer was complete, the older woman even waived some of the interest. She did frown a little, though, when she looked at the records. "I wouldn't have expected that of Joska," she murmured. Then she shrugged. "I suppose that's what happens when you go through enough hard times for long enough. Poor woman certainly had her share of bad luck, and if she was willing to sell her ship—" The duty master shook her head, and Savina tried to appear sympathetic. It was more difficult than it should have been. Then she made her way out of the dock, after calling Benny on the wavelink and instructing them to have Rafael get the cargo unloaded and the fuel cells loaded up. The bustling streets of the enclosed hive of a city were a haven of poverty, misery, and degradation of every type. Exactly the kind of place Savina felt at home. She put on her most innocent smile and let her walk take on the odd skip of a provincial who'd never been in a docking port city in her life and was unaccustomed to the unfamiliar artificial gravity. It worked. Within a couple streets, 3 rough-looking individuals were following her, making almost no attempt at concealment. She allowed them to herd her into a small back alley, and when she emerged a few minutes later, sheathing her knife, her purse was a good deal heavier and her temper a good deal restored. Finding the thrusters was more of a problem. She'd never had any interest whatsoever in knowing the inner workings of a ship. She'd still have no interest in knowing the inner workings of a ship, except that this appeared to be the only way she'd make it back home. At last, she had to resort to calling Joska on her wavelink and getting brand names of used models that might do what she needed. When she reached the used parts dock, she tapped her wavelink to connect with Joska's, so the captain's palm screen would show everything Savina was seeing. "Tell me which ones we want," she whispered as she wandered up and down the aisles. Judging by what the dockmaster had said, Joska wasn't the type to knowingly sabotage her ship, no matter how irritated she may be. Besides which, if the thrusters failed, all 4 of them would be stranded together. Joska certainly must have guessed that, should that happen, when a ship came to tow them back, there'd likely be only 2 passengers awaiting rescue. "Those ones," said Joska's voice in her earpiece, as Savina's eyes fell onto a heap of unpromising scrap metal. "Ask for the B-73 model thrusters." Savina wandered in the direction of the stall, keeping her eyes on everything except what was in front of her. She stumbled into the pile of parts, gave a soft little exclamation of surprise, and looked up innocently into the face of a large man with a scowl on his face. "Damn," came Joska's voice. "Best keep walking. He'll try to skin you for everything you have if he doesn't do worse." "What you want, girl?" the man growled. Savina gave him a wide-eyed smile and a slightly embarrassed laugh. "I'm looking for ship's parts," she said. I don't really know what I need. Do you think you might be able to help me?" The man's dour expression was rapidly changing to one of calculation, then greed. "I may be able to," he said cautiously. "What are you looking for?" I just bought a ship, and the thrusters aren't working, she said, letting a little disgruntlement show in her tone. He nodded brusquely, but she could see the gleam in his eye. And what sort of price can you afford? I'll need used ones, I know that, she said with a hopeless shrug. I don't know enough about ship's parts to even know where to start. What model's your ship? He asked. She repeated what Joska whispered into her earpiece, making her voice a little uncertain, and he nodded, stepping over the two thrusters she'd been watching from the corner of her eye, and straight towards a heap of thrusters that even Savina's untrained eye could tell were garbage. Those 'd last you maybe one day's flying, whispered the captain's voice in her ear. I think the ones I have now are in better shape. Since you're looking for top quality, the man said, turning around and patting one of the ancient thrusters, this is the best you'll find around here. I don't generally offer guidance to my customers. Let them figure it out themselves, but you look like a decent person, and I'd hate to see you cheated somewhere else. Savina widened her eyes. Oh, thank you. I was so worried I wouldn't be able to find something. How much? He studied her for a moment, calculating. Normally, I'd ask 5,000, he said. But seeing as you got fleeced when you got the ship, I'll cut the price down to 4.5. Savina moved over to stand beside him, running her hands down the scored sides of the thruster as if in indecision. You say these are the best? He nodded. I wouldn't advise going with anything less. You don't want to get yourself stranded. She sighed, still running her hands along the thrusters. Well, I agree with you, but I just don't have that kind of money. She made her voice as regretful as possible. I guess I'll have to take my chances. He frowned slightly as she glanced around her, then pointed to the two thrusters the captain had indicated. I'll take these instead, for 1,500, since, as you say, they're in such terrible condition. She gave him a sweet smile. His face darkened in anger as he stepped over to her, his fists clenching. What you're going to do is, he began, in a voice heavy with menace. Savina, whose hand had strayed to her pocket, pulled out the small shock trank and slapped it against the back of his neck. His eyes widened for just a second, and then he went down, convulsing. Savina bent over him and delicately detached the device, calling loudly, Somebody help! This man's collapsed! Get a medic! People glanced up in alarm, some calling for a medic, while others crowded over to help or gawk. In the confusion, Savina shouldered the two thrusters, smiling in satisfaction. These are the ones you wanted, right? She whispered as she started back for the ship. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the wavelength, and then Joska said, her voice tinged with humor, And if you'd been wrong? You'd have gone back and knocked him out again? Savina smirked. Don't tell me he didn't deserve it. This time, the captain actually chuckled. Oh, he absolutely deserved it. I haven't enjoyed seeing someone get taken for a ride that much for a very long time, but yes, those are the thrusters I wanted, or rather, you wanted, assuming you intend to get the ship back to Colorado without breaking down on the way. Savina slipped out of the used parts dock, still smirking. A woman brushed past her, and Savina turned in irritation. Then she almost dropped the thrusters. The woman was a little taller than Savina, her dark hair cut in a sleek half-shave, her figure lithe, the muscles of her back and shoulders defined even through her clothing. And there was something about the way her hips moved as she walked, the way her gray suit clung to her curves that made Savina's mouth go completely dry. She'd seen plenty of attractive women before, mostly on her way to kill them, of course, an unfortunate hazard of her chosen career, but still, she'd never allowed herself more than an appreciative glance. This woman, though, even from the back, there was an undefinable air of danger to her every movement, a magnetic allure that pulled at Savina like a fishhook through her gut. Savina shook her head sharply and stopped herself with an effort from starting after the woman like a dog following a stake. This was ridiculous. She had a ship to repair and a trip back to Colorado to make post-haste. And here she was, staring like a hormone-addled teenager. She forced herself to turn away, but she couldn't resist a glance back over her shoulder. And she couldn't avoid the visceral jolt of disappointment when the woman had already disappeared into the crowd. She'd almost reached the loading docks, still distracted by the memory of the woman, when she caught the faintest movement from the corner of her eye. Her mind snapped back into focus, and instinct sent her diving to the ground. A shot slammed into the edge of the stall where she'd been standing, the shockwave that would have cut through skin and muscle like a projectile ringing harmlessly through the metal instead. She scrambled beneath the shelter of the stall as the surprised owner gaped at her, and after a cautious moment, she peered out into the crowded market, which had gone suddenly silent at the sound. Not an ordinary occurrence, then. "Benny!" she hissed into her wavelink. "I need you to get the thrusters back to the ship. Get Rafael to help you. Use his restraint if you need to. I'll send you the coordinates. I ran into some trouble." She glanced around, then tucked the heavy thrusters into a small gap between two of the vendors' stalls. "My sibling will be coming for these," she whispered to the stunned stall owner. Then she started forward at a crouch, keeping her body low. When she'd gone 20 meters or so, she took a deep breath and straightened cautiously. Another shot hissed out into the silence, but she'd been waiting for it, dropping back down even as it dispersed against the wall behind her. Well, that solved any uncertainty about who the target was. Damn her inattention to hell, she hadn't even noticed she was being followed. "Joska," she hissed into the wavelink. "Once you have the thrusters, how long will it take to get the ship running?" There was a moment's pause, then Joska said, "Rafael says if he's working fast, he could maybe get us ready to go in an hour." Savina shook her head grimly. "Tell him I'll give him half that, and if he can't do it, he won't have to worry about me killing him, because someone else will. If they're after me, they'll damn well gun down anyone who's with me, and that includes you and Rafael at the moment." She shut off her wavelink, yanked a tiny cylinder from her pocket, and tossed it into the air. Even with her face turned away and her eyes squeezed shut and pressed into the crook of her elbow, the flash of brilliant white light was enough to make her see stars. Anyone looking directly at it, for instance, someone watching for Savina to poke her head up again, would be seeing nothing but that flash for the next 10 minutes. She jumped to her feet and ran, ducking past stalls, leaping over stacked ship parts, and dodging down narrow corridors, grimy from disuse. She gritted her teeth against the stitch in her side as she ran. She hated running. She'd always hated running. And she'd been doing a damn lot of it these last few days. At last, when her chest ached and her heart felt like it would pound out of her chest, she slowed, panting heavily. "Time!" she gasped into her wavelink and glanced quickly at the readout on her retinal screen. 15 minutes since the first gunshot. Maybe she'd lost whoever it was, and then something hissed through the air behind her, and again it was only instinct that made her leap to one side. A thin wire bolus clattered against the corridor walls in front of her, and she swore and took off again at a run. She glanced at the readout of the station on her retinal screen, swearing through her teeth. She couldn't run for much longer. Besides, better to wait for her pursuer somewhere she'd have the advantage. She turned down a narrow corridor, then another, people jumping out of her way as she ran, until she was in a part of the station that was almost deserted. She dropped down behind the corner of one of the hallways, forcing her breathing to slow, and peered carefully out the direction she'd come. She had every intention of killing whoever this was, but she'd rather ID them first, get some idea what was going on. She waited for what seemed like an extraordinarily long time, but still no footsteps. She closed her eyes for a moment, her breathing finally steadying out. Had she actually lost them? It didn't seem possible, but a small sound made her jerk her head up, just in time to see a tiny gas cylinder bounce off the wall in front of her and roll around the corner, hissing malevolently. She swore through her teeth. The gas was already thick in the corridor behind, and the best way out was clearly in the direction she'd already been running. But she hadn't lived as long as she had by doing the expected. She yanked out a knife, launching herself around the corner in the direction the cylinder had come from, and rammed into someone hard. The woman turned with a startled curse, and for a heartbeat their eyes met. Savina swore again, her voice choking in her throat. It was the woman she'd passed earlier. She looked to be around Savina's age, her skin a few shades darker than Savina's own, her hair still sleek and unmussed despite the pursuit. Her lips were pulled into a cold half-smile, her her features sharp and elegant and as coldly beautiful as Savina would have expected. But what caught Savina's gaze and held it were the woman's eyes, an icy slate hazel as cool and ruthless as a mountain cat's. They were the eyes of a predator, calculating and merciless and utterly mesmerizing, and for a moment, as those eyes met hers, Savina found she couldn't breathe. And then the moment passed. The woman grabbed for a weapon. Savina slapped her hand away, raising her knife, but the woman grabbed Savina's wrist and twisted. The knife clattered to the ground, and Savina kicked out hard at the woman's knees, swearing through her teeth. The woman stumbled back, but her free hand was coming out from behind her back, and Savina caught the glint of a pulse gun. Desperately, Savina yanked out another flare, shoved it in the woman's face, and set it off. The resulting flash knocked both of them completely sightless. Savina groped for the wall of the passage, swearing silently, then, keeping a hand on the dirty wall and trusting to luck, started off at a run. The woman's footsteps were close behind her, but she wouldn't be in any better shape than Savina was. Worse, probably, since Savina had at least squeezed her eyes shut before setting off the flare. "Get me back to the loading dock," she muttered into her wavelink. "Auditory directions. And don't let me bump into anyone." She could hear, as she turned a corner, hands still firmly pressed to the wall, the noise and voices of people around her. She yanked out a knife in her free hand and twisted her face into what she hoped was a threatening expression and kept running, praying that whoever was in her damn way had quick enough reflexes to jump aside. "Tell Rafael he'd better be ready," she muttered into her wavelink as she ran. "I'll be there in 10 minutes, and I'll be bringing company." "What happened? Are you hurt?" Benny's voice was worried. "I'm fine right now, but none of us are going to be fine if those damn thrusters aren't ready to go when I get there," she snapped. "And you can tell Rafael I'll shoot him myself before the bastard behind me has a chance to—" Her sight was returning slowly around the edges, and although the center of her vision was still obscured by a white starburst, she could tell she was approaching the port docks. She took her hand from the wall and started into the crowd, shoving her knife back into her belt as she pushed through the throngs of embarking and disembarking space passengers. The woman was probably still after her, but her sight wouldn't be any better than Savina's, and she wouldn't dare shoot into a crowd like this. Probably. But as Savina played the attack back in her mind, something cold settled into the pit of her stomach. "Benny, there's no way that government agent could be here by now, could they?" she asked abruptly into her wavelink. There was another pause. When Benny spoke again, their voice was sick. "They issued her a ship with a new drive tech. If the yacht sent your information back immediately, and she guessed where you'd come, it's possible." Savina swore. This wasn't good. She'd been raised on stories of government agents, the horrors and the atrocities they'd carried out on the old believers through the centuries, and they were notoriously good at it. By the time she reached the Dolphin, breath tight and legs aching from weariness, the ship was already running. The loading ramp was down, and Benny stood at the top, face creased in concern. "Savina?" they began. There was the hiss of a pulse rifle, and a searing pain blossomed in Savina's shoulder. She stumbled, with a whimpering, shocked little scream. "Savina!" Benny's face was frantic. "Get down!" Savina panted. She was still on her feet, somehow, her shoulder burning like fire. "Get down, damn it!" Benny dived to the ground as another shot hissed through the air, ringing loudly against the wall of the loading ramp where Benny's head had been. Savina yanked out her own gun and fired blindly over her shoulder, then scrambled into the ship. She grabbed Benny and shoved them ahead of her as the ramp closed behind the two of them, running up the narrow corridors towards the flight deck. "Joska, go!" she shouted, hooking into the ship's wavelink. "Go now!" The ship was already rising gently from the bay floor, making the captain's curt acknowledgement scarcely necessary. They reached the flight deck, and Savina shoved Benny into one of the launch seats and pushed the strap into their hand, then dropped into the one next to her, strapping herself in with her good arm. The ship shot forward, the acceleration pushing Savina against her seat, the pain in her shoulder sharp enough that she had to fight against the black crowding the edges of her vision. The bay's outer airlock doors hissed open, And then they were out, the station shrinking rapidly behind them. Savina let out a breath of relief and blinked back a lightheadedness that she wasn't sure was from the zero grav or shock from her injury. "I hate to bring this up, but if you want me to keep us alive, I need to know," said the captain grimly, looking up from the controls. What the hell was that about? Savina took another deep breath and let it out slowly. The pain from the pulse shot was radiating hot through her shoulder, and now that she was safe, her muscles had gone weak and shaky. Her legs ached, and her chest burned from running. "Government agent," she said finally. There was a moment of silence. "That's not good," said Joska. "A government agent isn't going to give up that easily." She glanced down at her screen, then swore quietly, shaking her head. "You might want to take a look at this, Savina." Groaning, Savina slipped her feet into the mag boots and unstrapped herself, then made her shaky way over to the ship's screen. She could see the shape of the station behind them, clear on the screen. And in front of the airlock doors of the station, just hissing closed, there was a small, compact ship, one that looked incredibly fast and incredibly dangerous. "Damn it to hell," Savina muttered. Chapter 17. Alba. "Don't tell me it's impossible," Alba snapped impatiently. "I know exactly what that word means. It means you don't want to put in the requisite effort." Feliu looked uncomfortable. Inez looked horrified. Josip looked unperturbed, but she could sense concern in the creases around his eyes and mouth. "I didn't say it was impossible, madam," Feliu said stiffly. "I said, the captain of the ship informed me that until we're several days' travel further on, it will be impossible to create and maintain the secure communication line required by protocol. And he has also informed me that he doesn't have the authorization to break protocol, not without significant—" "If I may," broke in Josip, his voice as mild and friendly as always. "I know we don't have authorization to break protocol, but I know someone in the communications bay. She's offered to let me call back to speak with my son if I ever want to. I can't imagine she wouldn't do us a favor if we ask nicely." They all turned to stare at him. He shrugged, a broad smile wrinkling his face. "She has a daughter who's around the age my grandson would have been, and we got to talking." They all were still staring. Alba recovered first. "All right, I suppose if she's willing to break every regulation in the books to allow you to talk to your son, she may be willing to do the same to allow the Chief Justice of the entire Joias System to speak with the President," she said bitingly. Josip's friendly smile broadened. "I can't see why she wouldn't. I'll take you to her, and we can ask." The trip down to the communications bay took an absurd amount of time. Josip seemed to know every person they passed, whether officer, crew, or maintenance, and he greeted them as if he and they were old friends. Alba gritted her teeth in annoyance. But still, if this ridiculous habit of Josip's of striking up a conversation with every person he met was the thing that would allow her to get word back to Onder, she supposed she couldn't complain. "It's 6 o'clock in the morning back on Do Sol," said the woman at the communication booth. She'd introduced herself as Adela after she'd greeted Josip, and they'd talked for an absurd amount of time about Adela's daughter, who was apparently staying behind with Adela's wife and her parents just outside the city, details Alba had had no desire to know and would endeavor to forget at the earliest possible opportunity. "Will your friend be awake, do you think?" They'd all judged it prudent not to be entirely forthcoming about Alba's identity or the identity of the person she wished to contact back on Colorida, and she wore a shawl over her hair, the shadows of which did a decent job of obscuring her features. Alba shot the woman her iciest glare. "If he's not, he certainly will be when I'm finished." The woman stared at her for a moment, taken aback, then chuckled softly, apparently believing it was a joke. She tapped through the codes to open the line and stepped back, gesturing Alba to the seat. "You'll need to put in the security code for the line." Alba stepped up, tapped in the code, and then let the scanner read her thumbprint and face. The woman checked her controls, then smiled. "Perfect. That should get you through, as long as your friend answers." Alba narrowed her eyes and murmured, "He'd better answer." The woman chuckled again, a soft, comfortable sound, and turned to Josip. I suppose we should leave your friend to talk in peace. Oh, and you'll love this. The other day, my wife sent Nina out on her own to the market for the first time, and on her way over... The door closed behind them, and Alba turned back to the screen. After far, far too long, it brightened, and she saw the president's face, his eyes puffy with sleep, hair flattened on one side. Madam Chief Justice? His voice came out gravelly. Alba glanced behind her reflexively, but she was alone. I saw the news packets, she snapped. What's happening down there? Ander shook his head, looking slightly more awake now. It's not good. Worry winkles creased his face, deeper than they had been when she'd left. I've tried to keep the government speaking with a united front, but Cavaco insisted that all viewpoints must be able to have their say, and he convinced enough of the ministers to back him that I wasn't able to stop it. And it's not just that. He must have plenty of non-government people on his payroll. Every other news packet is a report from a scientist, or a security expert, or someone similar, giving an opinion that a preemptive strike against the aliens is our only option for survival. You can't counter it with genuine scientists? She asked, worry sharpening her tone. Ander shook his head wryly. Somebody's threatening any of the scientists who might be willing to speak out. I've contacted a dozen of them to ask if they'd give an interview. No restrictions on what they could say, but at the last minute every one of them either backed out or disappeared. He sighed. We can't even pay them off like Cavaco does. The counselors in my jurisdiction and yours might be self-interested, but most of them aren't completely corrupt. If we tried something like that, someone would grow a conscience and report it. But Cavaco is military, and so are his people. They do what he orders, and that's that. Alba nodded silently. This was damnably bad timing, said Ander grimly. You know my voice doesn't hold the same sway in the council that yours does. I don't know how to fix this. Things are moving too quickly. If you'd held back on that proposal of yours until after we dealt with the portal, he may not have felt the need to... Alba cut him off sharply. If my proposal had come after we dealt the portal, the situation would be exactly the same. You know as well as I do, he's been looking for any excuse to expand his authority. Ander hesitated for a moment, then nodded wearily. She couldn't tell if he didn't dare argue with her or simply knew it would be no use. Then he frowned. I'm glad you called, actually, he said, voice uncharacteristically grave. I was trying to think of a way to get a hold of you. He turned and rummaged through the drawers of what was probably his bedside table, emerging at last with a holodisc. He tapped it on and expanded the screen. She leaned closer, squinting at the wavery lines of text. This is the list of the people we sent with you, he continued, running his fingers down a string of names. And here, on the side, are their qualifications. Alba nodded impatiently. Yes, you gave that to me before I left. Except one of my aides came in 2 days ago, he said quietly. She'd been looking through some of the information, preparing a report on the mission, and... He paused, and she could see the unease in his face. Their backgrounds were forged, he finished at last. Most of these people belong to Cavaco, and that's not all. Oh, for the mystery's sake, spit it out, she snapped, trying to hide her sudden, sick dread. He looked even more worried, and even more miserable. The ship's lists. They may not be accurate. What does that mean? It means, he said, even more quietly, that there are likely people the general smuggled aboard. People who aren't on the ship's lists. Who he'd send along and why, I have no idea. All we know is the ship's passenger lists were tampered with. There was a long moment of silence. Alba closed her eyes for a moment, the flutter of her heartbeat quick and dizzying in her chest. She took a deep breath, pulling on her iron control. And what does this mean for the mission, then? She asked briskly, proud of the fact there was not even a tremor in her voice. President Ander shook his head. I don't know what he's planning. He paused. Alba, you need to come back. This mission is a disaster in the making. Alba watched him for a moment, forcing her face into a chilly impassivity. Cavaco had set her up. What his endgame was, she still didn't know. Perhaps to sabotage the mission, then spin it as a failure, and use that as a final impetus to take control. Or perhaps to get her to abort the mission herself. If she didn't guess correctly, she'd be playing into his hands. "I shall consider the matter and get back to you," she said at last. The president nodded, worry still cut deep into the lines of his face. "Do you know exactly who is compromised and who is not?" she asked. He shook his head miserably. "We know some names. I'll send them through to you. But whoever forged their credentials was talented, and there's no way of knowing if we found them all. I can't definitively tell you that you can trust anyone on the ship." Alba gave a short nod. She'd have to figure it out on her own then. Onder had always been a bit useless. She pictured the woman from the main deck, her military bearing, her contempt for Alba. That entire situation made much more sense now than it had a few minutes before. There was a cold fear in her chest that she wasn't entirely sure what to do with. What the hell was Cavaco playing at? "I'll contact you shortly then," she said at last. "Don't take too long," he said quietly. "Whatever he's planning, if we don't act quickly, I'm not sure we'll be able to stop it." He tapped the screen off, and his picture faded. For a few moments, Alba sat staring at the blank screen. At last she rose, her muscles and joints stiff and aching, her body tight with unease. When she opened the door, Josip was still deep in conversation with the woman, both of them smiling broadly. But when he caught her expression, Josip cut the conversation short with a friendly excuse. "What happened?" he asked quietly as they walked back down the now silent hallways. She gave a brusque shake of her head. She had no idea now if she could trust even him. She should be used to it after a career in politics. But something about the creeping menace of the situation, trapped on a ship in deep space, the unimaginably high stakes riding on the outcome, made a cold, unfamiliar fear coil itself deep into the pit of her stomach. "He what?" Feliu's voice was equal parts shock, worry, and outrage. "He, or someone near him, falsified the credentials and backgrounds of at least some of the people on our expedition," Alba repeated grimly. "And the president couldn't tell me whether they'd found them all. The upshot being we have no idea who we can or cannot trust. Furthermore, it appears there are passengers on this ship who do not appear on the ship's lists." Feliu shook his head and leaned back against the wall, looking suddenly very weary. He certainly couldn't have gotten to everyone on the ship. That would be impossible, especially considering the short timeline. But he could have gotten more than I'd like to think about. "In the end, it hardly matters. One is enough to poison the entire batch," said Alba. "As long as we're not certain, we don't dare trust anyone." Feliu shook his head slowly. "That's not entirely true. Your personal staff, I looked into them myself. There's no way the general would have known I'd do that, and no way he could have falsified the amount of data I went through." He paused a moment. "As I think of it, there were some suspiciously attractive candidates that I hadn't expected, but I make it a habit not to go into things with merely a surface understanding of the subject." A bit of prickly pride had returned to his tone. Alba nodded, fighting back the hint of a smile. She had been on the receiving end of his reports for years now, and she could verify, with no doubt whatsoever, the veracity of Feliu's words. He'd probably looked into Josip's and Inez's hospital birth records, and possibly those of their parents as well. Even Cavaco would have no way of pulling one over on someone as thorough as Feliu. If mundane details were an art form, he was a master artist. "All right," she said, "that's 2. Well, 4 if you include the 2 of us." Feliu was shaking his head again. "That scientist that you asked to be placed on staff, Aran, he's been a planet-wide celebrity for years. I think we can be certain he is who he says he is, even if we're not certain about his relative sanity," he added wryly. Alba thought of the quiet young man who'd inadvertently rescued her the previous day, and nodded slowly. He certainly wasn't one of the General's creatures, unless his ability to hide his connections was unparalleled. She knew the thoroughness with which every news reporter on the planet had looked into his background. "And I suspect his friend must be trustworthy as well," she said. "They came in with him, and I hear they've been traveling with him for years as an assistant. In fact, I understand the two of them were friends in university. They've been friends since childhood, actually, said Feliu absently. I looked it up. He turned to her. That brings the number of people we can trust to 6, so, madam, what do you intend to do next? I intend, she said grimly, to do my utmost to find out exactly what our friend the General is planning. The young man stood awkwardly in her cabin, looking as if he'd rather be anywhere else in the system, including off the ship with no spacesuit. Now that she had the leisure to study him, she could see his sweet, slightly dreamy half-smile and a wistful air that belied the daredevil man-of-the-world reputation synonymous with his name. His friend, with their challenging glare and stubborn expression, was the one of the two she would have guessed closer to the reputation the news packets had given Aran, although, if she were being honest, neither of them looked particularly likely. Inez, however, was staring at the two with a look of something like hero worship on her face. Aran frowned as Alba finished a succinct summary of her conversation with the president. General Cavaco, he said, glancing over at Istve as if confirming a suspicion. That means... From the look on Istve's face, they found the news both worse and less unexpected than Alba had anticipated. Emmerich, they said shortly, something murderous in their expression. The two shared a long, meaningful glance. As you are standing in my presence, I would appreciate being led into the conversation, Alba snapped. Aran looked up, startled, then mumbled something she couldn't make out. Speak up, she snapped. You know how to behave in company, I assume? Or are you some homeless beggar? The young scientist flinched, looking like she'd slapped him, and from behind her, Alba could hear the hiss of Inez's indrawn breath. Istve turned their murderous glare on her. Don't talk to Aran like that, they said, their voice quiet with menace, and don't use that as a damn insult. Alba was so taken aback that for a moment she couldn't summon words. No one had dared to talk back to her since she'd been a young law clerk, and they'd hardly dared even then. I will say exactly what she began, drawing herself up. Aran's eyes darted between Istve and her in a sort of hopeless dread, his shoulders hunching slightly, and Istve's glare became molten. Come on, Aran, they said, turning abruptly. We don't have time for this. Alba's gaze sharpened. Do you know who I am? She asked, her voice carrying a low, dangerous undertone to it that every lawyer in the system knew and feared. Istve, Aran began, putting a hand on their arm, but they ignored him completely. Yes, they said, turning back, the heat in their glare equivalent to the ice in hers. You're the one who threw half the kids Aran and I grew up with in jail for the crime of not having a home to go back to. Funny. Back where I come from, we use the term Chief Justice as an insult. Alba blinked at them in shock, then sucked in a breath. Aran flinched, and then a mild voice said, Istve, Aran, in tones of genuine delight. They all turned, and the fury in Istve's face was replaced, suddenly, with a hint of a smile, the tension in Aran's shoulders releasing slightly. Josip stood in the doorway smiling, Feliu behind him. Josip, said Istve, and although the irritation was still clear in their voice, it was muted under what could only be called friendliness. I didn't expect to see you here. I heard you'd come up to our section of the ship, and I couldn't pass up the opportunity to say hello, Josip said, shooting Istve and Aran a friendly wink. Aran! Collect any interesting samples lately? Aran's posture loosened farther, the hint of a smile starting on his lips. One or two look promising, but I haven't had time to go through them yet. I'm hopeful, though. A delighted smile creased Josip's face, and Alba realized with absolute certainty that he was exactly as interested in the lives of these two idiots standing in front of her as he'd been in the life of the woman at the communications bay. It wasn't an act at all. He genuinely liked these people. Josip turned to Alba, his old eyes twinkling, his grin infectious. I apologize, Madam Chief Justice. I think I interrupted something. At his words, Istvay stiffened again, but somehow the antagonism, which had been sparking through the small cabin like static electricity, had diminished, and Alba found her own voice slightly softer when she spoke this time. "Aran," she said stiffly, "I apologize for getting off on the wrong foot." Aran glanced at the floor and mumbled something, but with a sideways glance at Josip, who'd taken a seat and was now smiling beatifically at the room in general, Alba bit back her sharp retort. "If you know anything about the general or his plans," she said instead, "I would appreciate you sharing that information with me." Aran sighed. "There's a scientist Istvay and me went to university with, Emmerich Furtado. When I got back from meeting with the council, he came to find me. He wanted to convince me to give up my spot on the mission so that he could go instead, and his backer was General Kavako. He knows I'm scared of space travel, so he thought..." Alba blinked at the young man, whose hands were clenching and unclenching nervously as he spoke. Aran Romeu, the swashbuckling daredevil hero of legend, frightened of space travel. She shook her head. This pair was not what she'd been led to expect. "And was that all?" she prompted, when it became apparent Aran wasn't going to keep talking. Aran hesitated, glancing at Istvay. Istvay heaved a sigh, turning to her with clear reluctance. "Possibly," they said. "Aran and I disagree on this, but I suspect Emmerich was the one behind the recent assassination attempt on Aran." Everyone in the room turned to stare at the two of them. "Assassination attempt?" said Alba at last, her voice a little sharper than she'd intended. Aran, too, gave a weary sigh, and from the look that passed between him and Istvay, Alba surmised this was a conversation they'd had more than once. "We don't know for sure it was an assassination attempt," he said at last, turning back to her. "But 2 days ago, when I was out collecting samples, 2 of the insects that we brought along for research ended up in my spacesuit, the speckled death moras." Everyone was still staring, and Alba found herself once again at a loss for words. "How are you still alive?" whispered Inez, breathlessly. "Aren't those things—" "Poisonous, yes," said Aran wearily. "But they're actually very shy creatures, and I was able to calm them down and get back into the airlock, no harm done." "And then you killed them, of course," began the girl, but Aran frowned as if she'd suggested cannibalism or something equally unsavory. "No, they went back in their cages. I've been trying to keep everyone else away for a few days to let them settle down. I'm sure it was just as unsettling for them as it was for me." His demeanor, now that he was talking about his field of expertise, was competent and matter-of-fact, every trace of nervousness gone. Alba was struck with a sudden, dawning realization of how Aran might have gotten the reputation he had and so clearly did not appreciate. Most people would not only have told the tale with much more relish, but would have saved it to pass on to their grandchildren. Aran didn't seem to realize that he'd said anything extraordinary at all. Istvay was watching their friend as well, shaking their head with a sort of fond resignation. And then Alba realized the implications of Aran's story, and her mood darkened. "You say you can't agree as to whether it was an assassination attempt," she said. "But it could have been?" Aran hesitated a moment. "I suppose I just can't imagine why anyone would do something like that." Alba studied him for a moment, then turned her attention to Istvay. From the way they were watching Aran, sharp worry in their face, they, at least, clearly believed that this had been no accident. "Thank you very much, both of you," she said, managing to make her tone gracious despite her lingering irritation. "I must say that in this I agree with Istvay. We know General Kavako falsified the information of a number of people on this trip. We don't know who, and we don't know why. Why they'd attempt to kill the mission's lead scientist, I don't know, but please, be careful." Aran had dropped his eyes again, but Istvay nodded, their gaze meeting hers. And for the first time, she noticed the hollows under their cheekbones, the way their large, dark eyes were accentuated by the dark circles underneath, the traces of exhaustion in their face that they couldn't completely conceal. She knew that look. She'd seen it far too often. They had a year, maybe 2, to live, and for the first time, She thought perhaps she knew why Aran had agreed to come, despite his fear of space travel. "Thank you," she said at last. Istvay nodded, then turned to Aran, and she saw the way their face softened, the faintest hint of a smile turning up the corners of their mouth. "Well, I suppose we'd best get back to work. Come on, Aran." They slid the door open and followed Aran out into the corridor. Alba watched the two leave, something cold in her chest. "If Istvay is right and someone did try to kill Aran, then we may be in a much more serious situation than we previously realized," said Felyu, voicing Alba's own fears as she turned back. He was correct. But what did Kavako want? Did he want them to continue or turn back? She would be playing into his hands if she made the wrong move, but what was the right one? Someone had tried to kill Aran. She couldn't rule out the possibility that they'd wanted to force the expedition to turn around. But neither could she rule out the possibility that they were meant to continue on, and that every person in this room was in grave danger. Chapter 18. Aran. Istvay didn't speak until they were back in Aran's cabin, and after one look at their clenched jaw and forbidding expression, Aran didn't say anything either. Once they and Aran were inside and the door closed behind them, Istvay paced back and forth for a few moments, their hands in fists, every muscle in their body tight. Aran tried to ignore the way the muscles in Istvay's arms and shoulders stood out, how their shirt clung to their chest. This was really not the time to be thinking about that. There were other things he needed to worry about at the moment, namely, who Istvay was going to kill first, him or the Chief Justice. Ani seemed to sense the mood as well. She slunk out of the nest he'd made for her under the bed and took shelter behind Aran's right leg. "I knew this trip was a bad idea," said Istvay at last, voice tense. "I knew it. Did you hear what that idiot said?" Aran glanced up. "By idiot, you mean the Chief Justice of the entire Joias System?" Istvay glared at him. "Yes. Anyways, the point is, if she's right, then this entire mission may well have been a setup." Aran sighed and reached down to pick up Ani. "Istvay, look, it's going to be all right. The entire mission can't be a setup. I saw the genetic material that came through the portal myself, and they let me run my own tests. Besides, Emmerich was practically drooling over the chance to be the one to find the cure for the defect. We know he's on General Kavako's payroll. If the whole thing was a setup, why would he be so eager?" The mention of Emmerich did nothing to improve Istvay's mood, which, in retrospect, Aran should have predicted. Their eyebrows lowered farther, their expression growing even more grim. "I have no idea what Emmerich may or may not want. But if that woman thinks there's something wrong with this mission, there probably is. She has access to better information than we do." Aran nodded absently, still stroking Ani. His hands were shaking, just a little. The thing was, he was already scared to death of this mission. Every damn part of it terrified the hell out of him, and so honestly, the thought that General Kavako had some nefarious scheme to interfere with it was hardly enough to register on the radar of things he was terrified of. But there was one thing he'd discovered that still had the power to tip him over the edge. And it was the thought that maybe, somehow, Istvay was right. That this had been a setup, after all. That there was no cure for the defect. He'd gone over every bit of information they had on the alien blood sample, run every test, studied every result of the research lab's tests. He still had no idea what was behind the specimen's survival. But he couldn't bring himself to believe it was nothing. He'd spent his whole life hoping for a miracle. There had been so many times in his life he damn well needed one, and it had never come. But this time, he had to believe it would work. If he lost Istvay... He cut off the thought quickly. He couldn't. That was all. He couldn't. "Aran! Are you even listening?" Aran glanced up guiltily. Istvay sounded even more perturbed than they had a few minutes ago. Sorry, I was just... Istvay glared at him for a moment in exasperation. "Then tell me what I said just now." Aran racked his brain frantically and came up with nothing. Istve sighed through their teeth. I was saying, Aran, they said with exaggerated patience, that this means what happened to you is probably not an isolated incident. You can't afford to let down your guard. Istve, listen, No, Aran, you listen to me for once. I just want... Their words trailed off, and they closed their eyes for a moment, jaw clenched. I just want you to be all right, they said at last, their voice barely audible. Aran stared at them, his heart pounding. He didn't know how to deal with this type of situation. He'd never really known how Istve was the one who dealt with things like this. But now it was Istve, not him, standing in the middle of the room, fists clenched, eyes closed, clearly on the verge of falling apart. Istve, he tried tentatively. Istve opened their eyes at last and tried to smile. I'm sorry, Aran, No! Aran's heart was still pounding. Sit. Istve gave him a puzzled look. Aran shook his head and dropped to the ground, his arms around his knees, and gestured to Istve. Istve sighed, but at last, slowly, they lowered themselves until they were sitting on the floor back to back with Aran, like they did when the two were out in the field after a long day of walking, and there was nothing to lean back against but each other. From the corner of his eye, Aran saw them stretch one leg out in front of them like they always did, their other knee pulled up against their chest. Aran closed his eyes for a moment, the familiar warmth of Istve's back against his comforting. He could feel the rise and fall of their breathing, quick and strained at first, but gradually slowing. Pishti, he said at last. What's wrong? And before you say it's that we might be killed, we've almost been killed about 1,000,000 times before. That doesn't mean I have to like it, Istve muttered through their teeth. Pishti. Istve took a deep breath, and was silent for so long that Aran wasn't completely sure they'd answer him. At last, though, they tipped their head back against Aran's wearily. Aran, they asked in a low voice, do you ever wonder, imagine there was something you'd been scared of your whole life, so scared of that you damn well gave up the one thing you wanted most because of it. You spent your whole life being so damn careful, making sure you didn't make any sort of impact on the world because you wouldn't be there long enough for it to count. And then you found out one day that maybe that thing you were so afraid of might not be real. It probably was real. The most likely outcome was that it was real, but there was just a chance it wasn't. Would that make it better, do you think, or worse? Aran stopped. He wasn't completely sure how to answer. Worse, said Istve, their voice almost too low to hear. It would make it 1,000,000 times worse. Aran closed his eyes and tipped his head back as well, pulling in a long breath. Even when he and Istve had both realized, when it had become far too apparent for either of them to ignore, that Istve carried the defect, Aran had been the one to panic, while Istve remained calm, patient, stoic. But now Istve was looking more exhausted, more strained by the day. Watching them fall apart was more frightening than anything else on this damn mission. And Aran found he couldn't keep his mind on anything, not even a potential assassination attempt, except for the stabbing, beating, painful hope that maybe, through the portal, there was something that would fix this. Istve was technically right. It was technically more likely than not that what had happened with the speckled death morass hadn't been an accident, but... He ran his mind over the small contingent of scientists. It was hard to imagine any of them actually trying to kill him. Besides, Istve had always been suspicious of basically everything. It could have just been a fluke, unlikely as that seemed at present. There was a tight knot in the pit of his stomach, and it took him a moment to realize that it wasn't fear, but an aching impatience. It didn't honestly matter what was happening on the ship, or if someone was trying to murder him. At the end of the day, the only thing that mattered was getting through the portal, and finding something that might let Istve live longer than another year. That was the only damn thing he cared about right now. It's been my whole life too, he said at last. I've spent my whole life worrying about you dying, but don't you see? That's the point. We have a chance now. Istve stood quickly, facing away from him, their body tense. Aran's muscles were oddly shaky. Damn it to hell, he had no idea how to handle this sort of thing. "Listen," he said at last. "You should get some sleep, okay? You'll feel better once you get some sleep." Istvay turned to glower at him. "I don't need you to be worrying about me right now. I wasn't the one who was almost killed, for hell's sake." Istvay rolled their eyes heavenward. "You know what? The whole point of all this is I've been trying to tell you to be careful, and I don't think you're even listening. We'll talk in the morning, because right now, I can't deal with this." They turned abruptly and stalked out of the room. Aran stood restlessly, shoving his hand through his hair. He should go after Istvay, probably, apologize for whatever the hell he'd said wrong, but they looked like they needed some time to cool down anyways. At this point, he'd probably only make it worse. So instead, after a moment's hesitation, he lifted Ani onto his shoulder and slipped out the door into the hallway. The ship never really slept. Out here, where day and night were abstract concepts, there was no reason for one watch to be busier than another. But it was that quiet time between watches that had long since become his favorite time, and since most of the scientists kept their schedules synced, the lab would probably be empty. There was no way Aran was going to fall asleep anyways, not now. And the quiet of the lab would be welcome. He flipped the lab's lights on and bent over the small table where he'd left the samples he was preparing to analyze. He dropped one of them into the centrifuge unit and flicked it on, the steady purr of the machine soothing and almost hypnotic. There had to be a solution behind the portal. There had to be. That was the only option. If he were being honest with himself, he'd been working so hard on these damn samples, mostly as a distraction, something to keep him from losing his mind from impatience. The centrifuge came to a stop, the red light flashing green, and he carefully unhooked the sample bag and pulled out the inset screen. Gently, he cut the screen in two and carefully slipped half into the feed of the mass spectrometer on the table beside him and the other into the feed of the accelerator mass spectrometer beside it. He tapped his palm screen against the mass spectrometer as the machine stripped the particulate matter from the collection screen. He pulled up the readout, then the analysis calculator, his shoulders relaxing at the pleasant familiarity of the routine. The lines on his palm screen flickered as the machine worked, and he turned, pulling up the lab holoscreen and tapping the data through. Slowly, the dancing lines on the screen came into focus. Aran sucked in a quick breath, fighting to rein in his excitement. Carbon. There were carbon-based compounds present. That meant the possibility of remnants of life forms. His heart skipped, just a little, as he dialed up the magnification, studying the readout more closely. Then he frowned. There was inorganic matter mixed in with the organic matter. That wasn't unexpected necessarily, but according to the composition of the readout, at least some of the inorganic matter came from metal alloys that looked unsettlingly familiar. It was a metal commonly used in spacecrafts. And unless he was entirely mistaken, no, he wasn't. That was a cluster of particulate signatures unique to burned fuel cells. His heart was racing, although this time it was more from dread than excitement. Organic matter diffused through the refuse of burned fuel cells and particles of ship metal. What had happened behind the portal? Had it opened by a horrible accident rather than on purpose, as they'd supposed? There was a chill rising up his spine. An accident, maybe, or maybe an intentional sacrifice. Really, what did they know about whatever was behind the portal? Nothing, except the most important thing of all, that it might hold the key to saving Istvay. He stood abruptly, tapping his palm screen against the accelerator mass spectrometer. If he could get a date on the particulates, it might give him a better idea. He tapped the readout, sending the data through to the large screen on the lab table, then scrolled quickly down the lines of data. The dating on the debris was entirely inconsistent. Some particles were dated a few months back, some almost a century. The longer he read, the farther up his spine the ice crawled. Whatever had caused this, whatever the tragic story behind these bits of mingled organic and inorganic debris, it hadn't been a single occurrence. Aran sank slowly into his seat. At last, numbly, he tapped his wavelink. Istvay's answering voice was short and irritated. "I was almost asleep. This had better be important." Aran didn't have the energy to respond to Istvay's tone. Pishti, he said quietly. I think you'd better come down here. Where are you? Istvay's voice was now sharp, more with worry than irritation. Is something wrong? I think it might be, said Aran. I'm in the lab. Istvay swore. You're in the lab by yourself after I just spent 20 minutes lecturing you about... They cut off their words, and Aran could almost picture the pinch of their lips. I'll be there in a minute, they said, and the communication was cut. Aran leaned back in his chair, his mind spinning dizzily. He had to be wrong. He had to have guessed wrong. When Istvay got here, they'd look at the data and come up with a completely innocuous reason for all of this. They'd laugh at his panic, and he'd apologize, and they'd both head back up to their rooms. There was a light tap on the door. Aran, it's me. I'm coming in. The door slid open, and Istvay stepped inside, their expression a struggle between irritation and concern. When they caught sight of Aran, concern quickly won out. What's wrong? They asked, striding quickly over to him. Did something happen? Are you hurt? Aran shook his head numbly and gestured Istvay over to the mass spectrometer readout. Istvay frowned, but glanced down at it, then back up at Aran. You found some organic matter mixed in with the particles. That's what you were hoping for, right? Did you notice the composition of the inorganic matter? Aran asked. Istvay gave him an odd look, but bent over the readout again. When they looked up again, Aran could tell from the look on their face that they'd seen what he'd seen. What? They began slowly, an undercurrent of unease in their voice. Now, look at this, said Aran. He tilted the screen on the table and ran his finger down the line of carbon dating. Istvay looked at the line of numbers, then back up at Aran. What does this... They broke off, a look of burgeoning horror in their expression, and it was that, more than anything, that told Aran his gut feeling had been correct. Ships, he said distantly, turning back to the screen so he didn't have to look at his friend's face. Something vaporized crude ships. That's why there's organic matter mixed in. And it didn't just happen once, Istvay finished, glancing back at the list of dates. It happened over and over and over. They shut their mouth in a grim line, glaring at the screen in the center of the table. What's the latest date on these? Aran glanced quickly through the readout. Maybe 6 planetary months before the portal opened. They looked at each other for a long moment. Istvay looked almost sick. Then there's something behind that portal that's been killing ships. Has been for a long time, they said in a low voice. I'd say a war, maybe, but if so, it's been going on for a long damn time. Aran nodded. Whatever's behind that portal, I don't think we can assume anymore that it's peaceful. Istvay straightened, their expression grim. We'll have to let the diplomatic team know. They glanced at the time display on the screen. That idiot Chief Justice will probably be in bed, but I think this is worth waking her for, although I expect she won't like it much. There was a hint of undeniable satisfaction in their tone. Aran sighed ruefully. Istvay was right, though. The Chief Justice needed to know, and she needed to know as soon as possible. The portal was only days away. Explain that to me again, please. The Chief Justice's voice was as cold as deep space, and just about as welcoming. She was sitting primly on the chair next to her desk in her small cabin, her hair wrapped in a colorful wrapper, a sleeping robe draped over her shoulders. Feliu, looking slightly rumpled, stood stiffly at the door. As you might imagine, having been just woken up from a very sound sleep, it will take me a moment to process this information. There was no mistaking the irritation in her tone, and it was clear that she did not mean for there to be. Aran glanced at Istvay's narrowed eyes and self-satisfied smirk and sighed. This evening, when I was looking through the samples I'd gathered from outside the ship, I found particles of both organic and inorganic matter. Since that's not usual in our system, we assume the particulate matter was blown through the portal when it opened and has been traveling outward since then. and the inorganic particles. The inorganic material was likely from some sort of spacecraft. I did understand that part, said Alba, bitingly. Please explain why you thought this discovery was interesting enough to wake me up in the middle of the night to discuss. Istve opened their mouth, and Aran continued hurriedly, before they had a chance to speak. I dated the samples. At first, I thought perhaps whatever energy source opened the portal, possibly an explosion, may have been the source of the particle, but that's not it. The dating didn't bear me out. The dates on these range from about 6 planetary months ago to about 200 planetary years. She was still watching him, as if waiting for a better explanation. He sighed. We can't be sure what this means, but one thing that I think we can be relatively certain of is that the particles came from ships that had been destroyed. Crude ships. He saw the realization dawn on the old clerk's face first. So, there's something behind the portal destroying ships, he said slowly, and has been for a very long time. Aran nodded. For a long, long moment, the cabin was utterly silent. If that's the case, then I believe it would be prudent to pause and reassess our options, said Alba at last. Her voice shook slightly, and under the stoic expression on her face, he could see the sort of sick shock that might accompany a dangerous injury. He'd never imagined the Chief Justice looking like this. Worried. Frightened. She turned to Feliu. Put me through to the captain, immediately. He nodded, and the four of them stood in utter silence as the wavelength buzzed, then at last broadcast the captain's face onto the main screen in the cabin. Madam Chief Justice. The captain's tone was surprised, but not unpleasant. To what do I owe the pleasure of this conversation? Captain, said Alba, I will provide you with a more fulsome explanation shortly, but the crux of the matter is this. Our lead scientist has discovered signs of a potential threat beyond the portal. I suggest we find a planet where we can stop and gather more information before we proceed. There was a long pause from the other end of the line. I'm sorry, Chief Justice, said the captain, an odd note in his voice. I'm afraid that's not an option. Getting to any planet that could host us would take us a significant distance out of our way. Then take us a significant distance out of our way, Alba snapped. I'm sorry, Madam Chief Justice. With the strictures of fuel and supplies, it's simply not feasible. Alba and Feliu exchanged glances, and Aran could see the worry in Feliu's eyes. Alba closed her eyes for just a moment, and for just a moment she looked old and slightly frail. Aran had always seen her before, on the news packets or in the council chamber, as someone as ageless and invincible as the planet itself. Now, for the first time, he saw the weariness in her face, the exhaustion in the lines of her posture. Then she straightened, her expression hardening once again into its haughty mask. Very well, Captain. If, as you say, it is impractical to find a place to wait while we take the measure of our destination with the new information we've procured. She hesitated for just a moment, and for just a moment Aran saw the indecision flicker across her face. Then it was gone. Then I order you, as head of this mission and the most senior government official on board the ship, to take us back to Colorado. Aran stared at her in cold panic. They couldn't turn around. This was his only chance to save Istve. She couldn't do this. The look on Istve's face was a sick mixture of despair and relief. I'm sorry, Madam Chief Justice. The captain's voice was still soft and friendly, but there was a note in it Aran couldn't read. I'm afraid I can't follow that order. Alba frowned. Captain, shall I remind you of my position? You may be the senior ship's officer, but I remain in charge of this mission. My orders are to be obeyed. I'm sorry, said the captain again, in that same soft tone. I have other orders. We're going through the portal as originally planned. Captain, wait, Feliu began. The information we've discovered indicates... There was a click as communication was shut off. Aran glanced around the cabin, his heart pounding strangely. They were going on, then. It didn't seem that what he'd found would make any difference at all. but the stunned looks on the faces around him told him exactly how serious the situation had suddenly become. Chapter 19. Savina. Savina, I need access to the defense systems. Jaska's voice was grim. For half a moment, Savina hesitated, but there wasn't time for mistrust right now. She spoke a command into her wavelink, turning the ship's systems over to the captain. Immediately, a low hum started deep in the ship's interior, and on the screen she could see the shields flicker on. These won't hold for long. Not if that ship has the weapons I think it does, said the captain. These were built for pirate attacks, which tend to be light range and a quick in-and-out attack. I doubt your agent friend is going to be quite so accommodating. She let out a short sigh, and Savina could hear the strain in her tone. I'm no A-rank pilot, but this ship's got me through some rough scrapes before. I'll do what I can. Savina gave a brusque nod. Thank you. The words felt awkward. After all, it hadn't been too long ago she'd held the woman at gunpoint and stolen her ship. But Jaska just nodded, her face set, and turned back to the controls. The pain from the pulse shot wound was radiating outwards from Savina's shoulder in hot, dizzying waves, and if gravity had been an issue, she'd have had to grab onto something to keep from swaying on her feet. Still, lack of gravity couldn't help the nausea rising in her stomach or the way her head spun. Savina! She turned quickly to see Benny standing beside her. Are you all right? What happened out there? They asked in a low voice. Savina tried to make her voice light, thanking whatever luck she still possessed that Benny couldn't see the extent of the injury. Nothing much. A shot grazed me. Benny frowned. It did more than that. I know your voice when you're hurt, Vina. Either way, we don't have time to deal with it right now, Savina snapped. She brought her wavelink online. Pull up specs on the ship following us, she said, tapping into the ship's command system. A few moments later, a readout scrolled across the bottom half of the ship's screen. Jaska looked up from her work for long enough to scan through it and gave a low whistle. Whoever wants you dead, my friend, they are very serious about it. I could have hauled cargo for decades and saved every penny of it, and I couldn't have afforded a ship like that. Savina, who'd seen the ship's financials, bit her tongue against a retort involving Jaska's inability to buy her own damn thrusters, and instead frowned at the readouts. She wasn't an expert on ships, but she knew weapons. The ship that was coming after them was loaded with them and coming up fast. If we can hold out until we have time to switch over to auxiliary power, we might surprise her, said the captain quietly. Her knuckles were white on the controls, her posture tense. I'm sure she'd beat us at a burst of speed, but the Dolphin moves along at a fair clip on auxiliary power. A hell of a lot faster than we're going now. If we can hold out until I can switch us over, it may buy us time to switch course and lose her before she can switch over to her own auxiliary power and follow. Savina gave a tight nod, gritting her teeth against the pain pulsing from her shoulder through her entire body. How long until we can switch over? Jaska frowned. 20 planetary minutes, maybe, half an hour. I've never had to use it in a hurry. Savina glanced down at the screen again and stiffened. 2 blue dots had detached themselves from the pursuing ship and started after them. We might not have 20 minutes, she said in a low voice. The captain followed her gaze and swore. Of course. You're the only one on the ship's port records. Aren't you? You wouldn't have wanted to list passengers, get people suspicious, so they have no idea they'd be shooting down anyone but you. She gave a small, humorless laugh. Her words, and the bitterness under them, sent an unexpected jolt of guilt through Savina. She quickly shoved it down. Get me statistics on how long it will take the missiles to reach us, she snapped into the ship's command, and a moment later the answer appeared on the readout. Savina swore, and the captain embellished on her curses. Any possibility we can pull the auxiliary power systems on in 10 minutes? Savina asked, without much hope. Jaska shook her head. No way in hell. Our only chance is for our shields to hold. And they won't, not with the kind of weapons they've sent after us. Savina gritted her teeth and turned to Benny, who'd been listening silently. 2 missiles, she said shortly. I'll send the specs through to your wavelink. We need to keep from being blown to space dust. You're the planner. Make it work. Benny shot Savina a glare, then turned to the captain. You have missiles on this ship? Joska nodded. Nothing to match that, though. And even if we could hit the agent's ship, it's too late. They've already launched the missiles. Are the missiles on this ship self-directed? Asked Benny, their voice brisk and businesslike. The captain shook her head. Manual aim, sorry. But you can fire them with shields on. Yes. Benny turned back to Savina. How badly are you hurt? I need you to tell me the truth. The captain frowned, her eyes traveling to Savina's injured shoulder as if she hadn't noticed. Savina shot her a warning look. I'm fine. I told you. Then I need you to do what you do best. Savina raised an eyebrow. Kill someone? Joska cracked a smile, and Benny rolled their eyes. No, shoot things. You won't have much of a target, and there won't be time for a do-over. You'll have to fire them straight into the oncoming missiles, and it'll have to be a direct hit both times. But if you get it right, our shields should be enough to take the resulting explosion. They paused a moment. I think, anyway, they added. I damn well hope you're right, said Savina through her teeth. Joska raised an eyebrow. You can do that? She asked. I guess we're all going to find out, Savina grumbled. The captain sighed, turning back to the controls. Take Rafael with you. You'll need someone to load the missiles while you sight in, and they can be a bit touchy. Savina gave a short nod and slipped out the door, her teeth gritted against the pane, without bothering to check if Rafael was following. He caught up with her outside the weapons bay door. He didn't look happy, but he didn't say anything, just hit the code on the door panel. When it hissed open, he stepped past her and set to work yanking at one of the two lockdown handles holding the missiles in place. Captain says you need to be able to aim, he grunted, not bothering to look at her. Shooting seat and scope are up there. May as well get yourself used to them while I set the missiles. Savina glanced towards where he gestured, then pulled herself up to the narrow seat and strapped in. It looked like the controls could be worked one-handed as well, which was a damn good thing. The thought of trying to move her injured arm made her almost want to pass out. She pulled the scope to her eyes and adjusted it. Are the sights set dead on or high? She snapped. Rafael gave a surly shrug. Haven't fired it in years, but I seem to recall them being pretty close to dead on. Missiles are online, so you can fire when you're ready. Hope you're as good as Benny thinks you are. She turned to glare at him, but he ignored her. She turned back to the scope, tapping her temple to pull up specs on the incoming missiles into her retinal screen. She'd have to hit precisely in the center of the explosive head for this to work. The armoring on the rest of the incoming weapons bodies was far too strong for the Dolphin's tiny missiles to do any good. She drew in a shallow breath, trying to ignore the throbbing pain in her shoulder and the knot tightening in her stomach. The missiles were 5 minutes from contact and closing. She tapped through to Benny's line. When do you want me to fire? I'll give the word, said Benny tersely. At the rate they're traveling... They paused a moment. I'd say wait for 3 minutes to contact, or under. We get one chance at this. Savina glanced down at the small screen on the weapons control panel. At this distance, the following missiles looked almost peaceful, curving a serene path through the black expanse of space. But she knew full well how quickly that illusion would shatter the moment they made contact with their target, or by the mystery's goodwill, her missiles made contact with them. Be ready to fire in 20 seconds, came Benny's voice in her earpiece. Savina readjusted the sights, dialing them down to adjust for the ever-decreasing distance, and rested her fingers lightly on the controls. 5 seconds. Savina drew in a deep breath, forcing her tense muscles loose. 2, 1, now! She let out her breath gently as she squeezed the control, pulling the trigger with a motion as gentle as the air escaping from her lungs. First missile off, she said, keeping her voice steady. Rafael yanked the other missile into place, locking the lever, and she readjusted the sights, drawing in another long breath. She fired again on the exhale, holding herself perfectly steady. And then it was off. She let herself slump in her seat. Nothing to do now but wait and watch. From the quiet, through her earpiece, she knew the two in the control room were watching as intently as she was. There was a moment of utter silence, then a brilliant, shocking flash, then another. She'd hit. Savina had time for a quick, relieved breath before the shockwaves slammed into them. The ship spun and tumbled, and Savina was thrown against her straps. She choked back a scream as the pressure hit her injured shoulder, and then everything went dark. When she blinked her eyes open, she was on the flight deck, strapped down into a reclining seat, and the captain and Benny were both bending over her. "What?" she began groggily. Then she gasped as the pain in her shoulder reasserted itself on her consciousness. "Why didn't you say you'd been shot?" Benny snapped, their voice harsh with worry. Savina groaned. "We made it?" The captain managed a small smile. "We're on auxiliary power as of 5 minutes ago, and I've been pushing every bit of power I can spare through to the auxiliary system. It won't hold our friend off forever, but it'll give us a few minutes breather. And if we pick a course they're not expecting, they may overshoot us and lose our trail." Savina let out a shallow breath, closing her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, the captain was still watching her. "You did well back there," the woman said at last, and for some reason the praise, unexpected and brusque as it was, made something warm stir in Savina's chest. "Now," Joska said, turning to reach into a medkit that was opened and anchored to the wall, "why don't you lie quiet, and between Benny and me, we'll try to get you patched up." She was smiling, just a little, and when she turned, their eyes met. And just for a moment, Savina felt something that was almost camaraderie in her glance. "Where are we going?" asked Raphael gruffly, as the captain sprayed a generous portion of med foam into the wound and fixed a bandage to seal it in. The captain glanced at Savina, raising an eyebrow in question. "I don't know this part of the system very well," Savina said finally, somehow unable to meet the captain's gaze. "I don't suppose you have any ideas?" Joska gave her a long look. "You stole my ship," she said quietly, at last. "You threatened to shoot my crew. Now you want me to find you a safe place to hide?" Her tone wasn't angry, more curious. "You need to get away as much as we do," said Savina, trying to make her voice carefree. "No," said the captain slowly. "No, that's not necessarily true, because the moment you fired those missiles, whoever's after us knew you weren't the only one on the ship. One person can't lock and fire those missiles alone. Maybe you have hostages, maybe you've smuggled yourself onto a crew, so I think she'll try to disable us and get aboard, and then you and Benny will go with her, and I'll get recompensed by the government for any damage to my ship, and hell, hard to tell exactly which damage was caused by the agent and how much was there in the first place. I might end up coming out ahead." Something cold had started in Savina's chest, mingling with the burning pain from her shoulder. "You can't be sure of that," she said sharply. "You can't be sure she won't just take the ship down, kill everyone on board. Even if you're right, the ship's in my name. The government will probably confiscate it." "Perhaps you're right," said Joska, considering her. "But it seems like it might be a risk worth taking. After all, I can't be sure you won't shoot me the moment we reach your destination." Savina turned her head away abruptly. "I can use the restraint, order you to do what I say." "You could," said Joska. "You can force me to follow the orders you set into it, or get whatever level of shock you've set it at. But you can't force me to come up with ideas about where you can hide. How would you know I was telling the truth? I could take you into the middle of a shipping lane and you'd have no idea, not if you're not familiar with this part of the system." Savina closed her eyes for a moment, sickness roiling in her stomach. "What do you want?" she asked finally, in a low voice. There was a sharp sting in the corners of her eyes as she said the words, and she squeezed her eyes tighter shut to push the tears back. She didn't cry. She never cried, but somehow the strain and exhaustion and pain of the past 3 days had cut through her defenses. The portal, the government agent, the judge and her diplomatic mission. The sick knowledge that if she didn't get back in time, there may not be anywhere to get back to. At last, Joska sighed. "Listen, as much as you deserve it, I don't relish the thought of watching 2 kids like you get killed, and I'm sure you'll make me pay for that sooner or later." But as you said, I can't be sure that if the agent shoots at you again, Rafel and I won't be caught in the crossfire, or that I'd get my ship back at the end. So, she shook her head. If I were to agree to take you somewhere out of the way, for starters, I'd need some guarantee that I will, in fact, be getting my ship back when I get you back to the planet, and that Rafel and I will be getting out of this alive. Savina blinked, staring up at the captain in confusion. The captain raised an eyebrow. At last, Savina gave a long sigh and pulled the ship's disk out of the inside pocket of her jacket. "Fine," she said through her teeth. "I can do that." She flicked it open with an impatient gesture, pulling up the ship's articles. "I do hereby transfer all my interest in the Dolphin to the undersigned, but such transfer shall not come into force until 1 planetary hour after the ship reaches a port on Colorida and hooks into the main system." Reluctantly, she handed the disk over to the captain, who took it without a change of expression, added her signature at the bottom, and handed it back to Savina. "Satisfied?" said Savina bitterly, turning away. She could feel the captain's eyes on her back. "That's a start," said the woman at last. "But I'm going to need more than that. I'm going to need you to answer some questions." Savina turned, startled. The captain's gaze was steady and piercing. "Why is it so important that you get back to Colorida? Why the hurry?" "Does it matter?" snapped Savina. The captain shrugged. "Maybe. I don't know." For a long moment, Savina glared at the woman, seething quietly. She could just kill her here. It would be so easy. But Joska was right. Savina needed her, at least for now. "I got some news," she said at last, the words choking in her throat. "A warning. If I don't get back, my family is going to be killed. I can't reach them through my wavelength, and the compound where I grew up isn't hooked into any general lines. They don't just let you call in or out whenever you want. And if the agent finds me, she'll find Benny, too." For some reason, the tears she thought she'd pushed back took that opportunity to well up, and she turned her head away quickly. For a long moment, the captain didn't speak. At last, she said quietly, "Benny, you two are siblings, I'm guessing, yes?" Savina gave a brusque nod, not trusting herself to speak. Joska watched her for a few moments longer. Finally, she straightened, turning back to the controls. "Well," she said, "a villain like you, just trying to keep your family safe. Can't exactly say I wouldn't have tried to hijack a ship myself if those were my options." She hesitated, and Savina could see the tension in her shoulders. "I know a detour we could take," she said at last. "I've used it more than once to avoid pirates. It might keep us out of the way of your friend." She shook her head and chuckled softly. "I must be an absolute idiot. You stole my ship and threatened to kill me. But since it looks like this is my only chance of getting my ship back, I'll take you there. If you give me your word as a lying, murdering criminal that you won't spread the coordinates around." Savina turned to stare at her. And then she found herself breaking into a smile of relief, something tightening in her throat just a little. "On my word, as a lying, murdering criminal." Joska shook her head with a rueful smile, then turned back to the controls. Savina cleared her throat. Thank you," she said, for the second time that day. The captain turned back with a sharp look, but there was a kindness under it that Savina hadn't expected. "How did you grow up, Savina?" she asked at last. Her voice was quiet, as if she were talking to herself, more than Savina. "What did they teach you about life in that compound of yours, where you can't call in or out?" Savina narrowed her eyes and looked away. She knew better than to trust kindness. She must have drifted off at some point, despite the throbbing pain in her shoulder, because when she opened her eyes again, the captain was standing, stretching out the kinks in her muscles. She glanced over as Savina's eyes opened and gave her a small smile. "We're in behind the remnants of an old dead star. The debris field and residual magnetics make it almost impossible to track anyone back here." Her gaze, as she watched Savina, was a little too perceptive. "It wouldn't be a bad thing for you to get some more sleep. I've set us a course, and the autopilot should take us from there. Nothing more for us to do at the moment, and If you're in a hurry to warn your family, it'll be easier if you're not passing out from pain." She paused, then added, "I guess murdering people and stealing ships takes more out of you than you'd think." Savina stared at her, too shocked to respond, and Joska chuckled, turning away. "Do what you want. I'm smart enough to take my sleep when I can get it. Rafael, wake me up at midnight watch." Rafael gave a terse nod from the co-pilot seat, but Joska was already gone. "I'll take first shift, Vina," Benny whispered. "Their restraints are set, so the two of them shouldn't cause problems." They paused. "Vina, are you—" "I'm all right," said Savina. "I'll be fine." It still hurt like hell, but between the metafoam and the bandage, she no longer felt like she'd pass out the moment she tried to move. Benny nodded, although they were clearly still unhappy. "Joska said there's a cabin just off the flight deck. Come on." They leaned over, fingers fumbling for the straps, and helped Savina sit up, guiding her feet into the mag boots. "Wake me up if you need anything," said Savina. "I will. Just go." Savina's shoulder ached, and her muscles were heavy with exhaustion. She shuffled into the small cabin and was asleep almost before she managed to strap into the cot. It wasn't a noise that woke her, although the noise came soon after. It was the way the ship shuddered, a small, incongruous movement in deep space, and one she might not have noticed at all if her nerves hadn't been so on edge. As it was, she jerked awake, blinking, and it took her a moment to reorient herself to the interior of the Dolphin, rather than the soft bunks and artificial gravity of the luxury ship she'd spent the last week on. There was a shout of pain from outside, and Savina was suddenly wide awake. She unstrapped with her one good hand, snatched up her gun, clipped her feet into the mag boots, and grabbed for the door control. From outside there was a grunt and the hiss of pulse fire. Then she was through the door and out onto the flight deck. For a split second, she took in the scene in front of her. Benny against the wall, face terrified. Rafael, eyes closed, body listing oddly against the straps on the co-pilot seat. And, in front of Benny, a small smile on her face. The woman whose face and figure had been carved into Savina's memory the day before, in the grungy hallway of the small port city. The woman's posture was casual, but she must have heard the door open because she was already turning, the barrel of her gun swinging towards Savina's face. Even in zero gravity, her movements bore the smooth, easy grace of a predator, her body twisting in a fluid motion. And for a moment, as those deadly hazel-gray eyes turned on her, Savina was completely frozen, her throat dry in a sick combination of magnetic attraction and dread. The woman's face still bore the cool ruthlessness that Savina remembered from the station, but there was something else underneath it. A vicious, icy hatred. "Vina!" Benny's shout brought her back to herself, and Savina ducked, using the leverage from the mag boots to pull her down as a pulse blast rippled over her head. Then she was up and lunging forward, grabbing the stranger around the waist and shoving her against the controls. Without gravity to offer resistance, they didn't fall so much as bounce against the console, the woman's hands scrabbling for Savina's throat. Pain rolled in nauseating waves through Savina's body at the impact, but she yanked a foot out of the mag boots, kneeing her opponent's hand and sending the woman's gun flying off towards the ceiling. The woman's other hand was already coming up, and Savina could see the glint of a knife in it. She jerked her body to one side as a knife slid past her, missing her neck by centimeters. It was so sharp that it took a moment for the pain blossoming across her shoulder blade to register, blood welling in odd, sticky globules along the line the knife had cut in her shoulder. She grabbed the woman's wrist and twisted it, gritting her teeth against the pain, and yanked a thin, sharp knife from her belt with her injured arm, driving it upwards towards the woman's rib cage. It skittered across the woman's suit, the strange fabric turning the blow, but a thin line of blood followed the blade upwards. Savina let the tip of it catch in the fabric, then shoved it home with all her might. The woman gave a quick, startled gasp, her eyes widening in shock. Then, with surprising strength, she pulled her wrist free and slapped her hand against Savina's arm. An agonizing pulse of electricity jolted through Savina's body, freezing her in place. Her jaw was clenched, muscles shaking, and she could feel the cord standing out in her neck, but her body wouldn't obey her commands. The woman stepped back, breathing heavily, and reached for a holster on her thigh, pulling out a small, deadly-looking pistol in a smooth, easy motion. Savina was going to die. She was going to die here in a beat-up ship in the middle of nowhere, and her family was going to die too. Then there was a soft hiss, and the woman jerked back, blood forming in a perfect, rapidly swelling globe against her shoulder. "Drop your weapon," said Joska from the doorway, in her dry, sardonic drawl. The gray-clad woman hesitated, but there was a quality to her movements that told Savina that, between the knife wound and the shot, she was hurt worse than she was letting on. She moved as if to obey, but Savina caught the way her muscles tensed. She tried to shout a warning, but her jaw was clenched too tightly, so she could only watch helplessly as the woman leapt forward, cat-like, slipping past Joska and disappearing through the door, tossing something behind her as she went. The small, round device hit the ceiling with a faint, metallic ting, a gaseous cloud roiling lazily from perforations in its sides. Benny and the captain both dived towards it, the intruder forgotten, and a moment later the cloud of gas was contained, the emergency filtration system kicking in with a low growl. "Savina?" Joska stepped over, tapping the butt of her pistol against the tranq device on Savina's arm. It dropped loose, and the force holding her disappeared. Savina leaned her head back weakly, an odd mixture of relief and disappointment flooding through her. Her muscles were rubber, her body hanging limply from her remaining mag boot. She felt oddly numb, the throbbing pain from the gunshot wound blending with the clean, sharp pain of the knife like two colors of paint, mixing and spreading. She turned her head to see that the wobbling, ruby-colored line of blood on her shoulder had grown, and she watched, fascinated, as a globule broke free. "Savina! Savina, answer me. Are you all right?" Savina blinked and turned back to the voice. Benny's face was frantic, and they were moving their hands gently down Savina's shoulders. Savina wanted to stop them before they reached the blood and got it smeared everywhere, but her tongue was oddly heavy. And then Joska was there, speaking in Benny's ear in calm, soothing tones, and reluctantly, Benny stepped aside. The captain peered into Savina's face, sighed, and stepped over to the medkit. She returned a moment later and tapped a disc against the back of Savina's neck. Savina gasped, the icy shock bringing her back to herself. "Better?" asked Joska. Savina nodded, although she felt a little like she was going to vomit, which would not be pleasant in zero gravity. Where did she go?" The captain stepped over to the ship's display, and Savina followed, a little unsteadily. From the base of their ship, a tiny dot detached itself, falling quickly behind. "I guess she didn't like her welcome," mumbled Raphael. He was sitting up again, despite the sickly tinge to his skin. The captain glanced quickly at him, then, apparently satisfied that he wasn't seriously injured, turned back to Savina, examining her with a critical eye. "That's a nasty-looking cut." Savina nodded, her teeth clenched shut. She couldn't afford to think about it right now, not if she wanted to keep the contents of her stomach down. "Best deal with it, then, before you lose too much blood. You too, Raphael. You're going to get fixed up before I trust you to pilot us anywhere. Come on, let's get both of you strapped down, and Benny and I will see what we can do." "It's no worse than when those smugglers took after us in Bello," Raphael grumbled, but his wan, shell-shocked expression belied his words, and he did as Joska asked. The captain was clearly accustomed to treating injuries. She worked quickly and efficiently, calling out orders to Benny, and soon both Savina and Raphael were bandaged and sitting up. Joska wiped her hands on a towel, still frowning. How did she manage to get close without the scanner picking up anything? And how did she get through the ship's airlock? "I have no idea," Savina muttered, but... Grimacing, she reached into a pocket and pulled out a small disc. Her hands shook, and it took more effort than it should have to switch it on. This might help. It took a scan of everything on her, documents, weapons, tech. The captain raised an eyebrow, watching as Savina flipped quickly through the glowing pages. "She has Delta-level cloaking," said Savina absently as she paged through. That would explain how she got on here, at least, and why the dolphin's sensors didn't pick anything up. But... She broke off suddenly, staring down at the glowing words floating in front of her. the agent had a DNA scanner, and Savina's blood was scattered in tiny droplets across the cabin and caught on the agent's blade. And the warrant, there was a copy of that too, the official that she'd send her report back to. Chief Justice Alba Espina. The moment the agent's latest report came in, it would match immediately with the mission ship's database. And there was something horribly, stomach-clenchingly familiar about the name of the mission ship. Nicolao's ship. The moment the report went back to the judge, his secret, the secret even he didn't know, would be out. And he would die. "Benny," she whispered. "Vina?" Savina turned to the captain, her voice distant, clinical, and calm. "Do you know if the news packets mentioned the name of the diplomatic ship?" The captain frowned. "Is it important?" "Very." Her voice was still calm somehow. How long did they have? Minutes? Hours? Days? She had no idea how often the agent sent in her reports. The woman who'd be reading the reports was the judge of heresies. The woman whose very existence threatened Savina's family and everyone she cared about. The woman who'd set a government agent after her. The woman who would watch as Niccolo died. For a brief, breathtaking moment, a memory flashed in her brain, her own mother bending, tears running down her cheeks, to lower a tiny, squirming bundle into a hole in the ground. Her baby brother's thin wails as the shovelfuls of dirt landed on his tiny body, his flailing arms, his face. The way the grass and pebbles cut into her hands as she and Benny scrabbled frantically in the dirt once the adults were gone. The sweet, sick relief that flooded her chest when he'd blinked his tiny eyes and drawn in a choking breath and whimpered, nuzzling his dirt-streaked face against her shirt. It wouldn't happen again. No one else would stand by to watch Niccolao die, not if she could stop it. The captain was still watching her, but finally she gave a faint shrug. "I can check, I suppose," she said, tapping her wrist to activate the wavelink. She listened for a moment, eyes distant, then nodded. "Here," she said, bending over the screen and tracing a line with her finger. "The ship is called the Fire Dawn. This is their route." Savina glanced over it quickly, the calm, icy cold still gripping her chest. She'd guessed right. It was his ship. Of course they'd have conscripted his ship. The route wasn't far from where they were now, maybe 24 planetary hours distant. "They shouldn't get in our way, if that's what you're worried about," said the captain, "and even with what happened, we can still make—" Savina cut her off. "There's been a change of plans," she said curtly. "We're not going back to Colorida." Now all the eyes in the cabin were on her, expressions ranging from curious to concerned. "I thought," Joska began, an odd tone in her voice. "We're going to meet up with the diplomatic ship," said Savina, tone still pleasant and very distant. "We're going to get aboard it somehow. And we're going to kill the Chief Justice." Chapter 20. Alba. They reconvened the next morning, a grim, silent group. No one looked like they'd slept, with the possible exception of Josip, and even his face showed sharp lines of worry. Istve stood protectively close to Aran. "I am no longer sure that we are intended to survive this mission," said Feliu at last, his normally dour face carved even more so by worry and exhaustion. Alba almost snorted. Leave it to Feliu to come up with a way to make an already terrible situation sound even worse. Still, he may not be wrong. The thought sent an unexpected thrill of fear through her, like a gulp of too cold water on a too hot day. "Then I suppose we'll have to figure out how to survive it anyway," said Josip. He smiled, but his smile looked more strained than usual. Alba took a deep breath. "We don't have many options, it appears, but let's review the ones we do have. We could find a way to get ourselves off ship if and when we stop by a planet for supplies." Josip shook his head slowly. "I already talked to someone I know who works in the nav crew. There are no planned stops between here and the portal." We could... Inez stopped, looking down quickly as Alba turned her eyes on her. "Inez, please," said Josip, his voice gentle and encouraging. "We can use any ideas right now, even if they don't work. Maybe it'll help us think of something." Inez glanced up at him gratefully, swallowed, and nodded. I only thought if we could mess with the supplies, sabotage them, maybe... Her voice faltered. That's not a bad idea, actually, said Istvay thoughtfully, looking away from shooting irate glances in Alba's direction. The moment the crew learns we're running short on supplies, I don't think they'll agree to keep going. Captain's orders are no. It's not a bad idea, maybe, Feliu snapped. Assuming the captain isn't willing to simply let us and the crew starve to death in deep space, and I'm not sure we can assume that's the case any longer. He turned to Alba. Madame, what do you think? Alba sighed. This was exactly the question that had kept her awake the previous night. I don't know, she said at last. I suspect Kavako intends for us to get to the planet and then sabotage the mission. However... She paused a moment, forcing her voice not to tremble. We can't discount the possibility that, as Feliu suggested, he simply intends to have us killed on the trip over. Alba had faced countless threats over the course of her career. Threats to her reputation, to her career, threats to make a fool of her, to cost her an election or an appointment. But this, something about the crass physicality of this threat, had awoken a primal, instinctual fear, something that made her muscles tremble and her voice shake, unless she kept an iron hold on herself. Josip shook his head again. I don't think they'll dare do that. According to people I know in the communications bay, there's enough contact back and forth for family and friends, news packets, so on, that it would be difficult for the captain to monitor all the feeds. There's no guarantee that word wouldn't slip out, no matter how careful they were. If you were killed, if any of us were killed, word would get back to the planet. Perhaps they felt safe attacking Aran because, brilliant as he is, he's not the only scientist on board. They could make an argument that the mission should continue without him, but the Chief Justice murdered... He shook his head. They couldn't risk it. If the general wants the mission to fail, and to turn the failure to his advantage, he'd have to make it appear that the trouble came from the aliens themselves, not from your own crew. Alba gave a curt nod. What he was saying made sense, but it wasn't a simple thing to convince her nerves of that. Even so, said Feliu, if we sabotage the supplies, we're gambling the lives of everyone on the ship. Do we want to take that risk? For a few moments, no one spoke. At last, Aran stirred and glanced up. Listen, he said, what if, instead of sabotaging the supplies, we just tell the crew what we found out? I mean, the results of our particulate research and our hypotheses. There are people on the ship who'd probably listen to me. There was something slightly grim in his tone, as if this was an unpleasant fact and one he didn't like to think about. Alba stared at him. As far as she had observed, not only were there people on the ship who'd probably listen to him, every single person on the ship would hang off every word he deigned to speak to them. Clearly, he either didn't realize this himself, or he preferred to pretend he didn't. He cleared his throat, obviously uncomfortable. If the crew understands the potential danger of going in without further study, it might have more or less the same effect as Inez's suggestion. Feliu nodded, looking faintly impressed. They'd have a mutiny on their hands, he said. If someone like Aran says something, from the rest of us, it could be construed as politics. But everyone knows Aran's commitment to science. There's no possibility the captain can spin it as some self-interested trick. He'll either turn around, or he'll go through the portal with no crew. I doubt even someone bought and paid for by Kavako would be that heedless of their own mortality. Istvay hadn't spoken for a while, but now they looked up. That means we'd go back to Colorida, correct? End the mission. Not just pause to resupply. Alba looked over at them, frowning. She couldn't read the expression on their face, but she caught their quick, unconscious glance towards Aran, the mix of concern and worry and something desperate that she couldn't tell whether was relief or disappointment in that look. Alba nodded. Yes, I suspect that is exactly what it would mean. She didn't have to say the rest, that if they went back, the chance that another diplomatic mission would be sent out was virtually nil. It meant the loss of the culmination of her life's work, the failure of a final, definitive proof that diplomacy could triumph over aggression, that wars could be won by speaking rather than with weapons. From now on, the argument that first contact with a new species could be dealt with without the military, and that the military committee could be disbanded, would be set back, possibly forever. But that wasn't all. If this mission failed, if they went to war against these aliens, or even if the portal disappeared and both parties were left in peace, the chance to find the cure for the defect would be gone forever. Aran was staring at the floor, clenching and unclenching his hands. "Aran," said Istve in a low voice. Aran closed his eyes. "I'll do it then," he said, raising his chin and conspicuously avoiding looking at Istve. "I'm sorry," Alba said without thinking, and then stopped, wondering where that had come from. Her, apologizing to some young biologist who wouldn't even look her in the eye. "I suppose there's not much more to discuss then, at least until we find out if this works," said Josip at last. "But we'll need to be careful. I don't think they'll dare kill the Chief Justice, but we can't be sure, and that goes double for the rest of us." He turned, looking at each of them in turn. "Until we know who we can or can't trust, don't go anywhere alone. Don't let your guard down. Lock your door to your cabin when you sleep. And keep a weapon on you at all times." Feliu nodded and reached under the desk, pulling out a large, bulky box. "I wasn't sure what we would be facing on this trip," he said stiffly, avoiding Alba's eyes. "I took the liberty of procuring some weapons. I hope they're acceptable." Alba raised an eyebrow in surprise as he opened the box, revealing a disturbing number of what, at least to her inexperienced eye, looked like highly lethal objects. Josip crossed over to stand beside him, then glanced over at Inez. "Have you used a weapon before?" he asked, his voice low and reassuring. Inez looked up at him and gave a quick little half-nod. My father used to take me out shooting redbirds when they were eating the crop," she said in her quiet voice. Alba frowned. The girl, though rather a pathetic thing, was clearly educated, and Alba had simply assumed that meant she was from Vila Nova do Sol, or at least the Belt. She knew, intellectually, that people in the Rim Mountains were just as likely to be intelligent and educated. It was simply that... She shook her head, pushing down the mildly disconcerting self-reflection. Josip nodded, still smiling that reassuring smile. "Good. Come pick something you're comfortable with, then." Throwing a timid glance in Alba's direction, the girl did as Josip asked, pulling out a serviceable-looking pulse pistol. It took Alba a moment to realize that the glance had been one of something close to pleading, as if the girl didn't know what Alba's reaction would be, but cared desperately. The thought sent an odd twinge through her. She'd all but ignored the girl up until now, treating her as nothing more than a necessary tool. But Josip hadn't. Josip had seen her, spoken to her. He wasn't surprised by the revelation the girl was from the Rim Mountains. He'd likely already known. "Only use it if you need to," Josip said. "But if you do need to, don't hesitate to use it. If someone is trying to hurt you, it's no sin to defend yourself." The others stepped over, choosing their own weapons. Feliu looked uncomfortable holding his, but Aran and Istve took their own with a familiarity that showed their experience. Of course, judging from the lives they'd led, Alba would have been surprised had they not been familiar with weapons. She stood back, watching, until at last Josip turned to her. He held out a small, deadly-looking pistol, offering it to her. "Madam Chief Justice, I expect you haven't had to use something like this previously, but I think this one should suit." She had to force herself to take it from him, and she wasn't sure she concealed the way her fingers trembled. The small, unfamiliar shape sat cold and heavy in her palm, the weight of it somehow menacing. Josip smiled at her, his gaze surprisingly gentle, and said, "I don't imagine you use pistols that often in your line of work. Would you like me to walk you through it?" She gave a short nod, absurdly grateful that he'd offered, rather than forcing her to admit that she had no idea what to do with the small, deadly thing in her hand. "It's not overly complicated," he said, taking it back from her for a moment. "This here will charge it. This trigger will release the pulse. Point it where you want to shoot and pull the trigger. You can discharge it a dozen or so times before it needs to be recharged. As long as the green light is blinking, it'll continue to fire when you pull the trigger. Once it's fully discharged and the light goes off, push the lever forward and pull it back again. It will take a few seconds, so try to do it at a time when you're not in the middle of being shot at. He was clearly trying to keep his tone light, but she could hear the worry in it, and she understood the import behind his words. As a judge, she'd condemned people to sentences that would lead to their deaths, if not directly, certainly indirectly. It was a statistical inevitability that some percentage of convicted criminals would take their own lives if condemned to a lengthy prison sentence or banished from the city or town where they'd been raised. But when she sentenced them, she'd managed not to feel guilt. She was only carrying out laws that had already been written. And even when she was the one writing the laws, she did so with the firm conviction that the law she was writing appropriately balanced the needs of the few and the needs of the many. But bringing up a weapon, discharging at someone in front of you, the brutal, immediate violence of it made her feel queasy. Josip walked her through how to set and release the safety, then handed the pistol back to her. And that's all you need to know. With luck, you won't have to use it. She nodded and, checking carefully that the weapon was charged and the safety on, tucked it into her reticule. "That will be our plan, then," she said sharply. "As Josip said, be careful, and watch out for yourselves and each other. We'll reconvene here when Aran has started the rumors spreading." She paused a moment. "Good luck to all of you." They murmured it back to her and shuffled out of the room. When they'd all left, even Feilu, she locked the door behind them and sank down on the hard-backed chair at her desk. The weight of the weapon in her reticule was heavy and uncomfortable, as hard and cold as the knot in her stomach.